today, looking at this principle that's been enormously important in our own lives, and it's that of redemption. And to do that, we're going to open up our Bibles and look at Romans chapter 8. So I'm going to invite Laura on now to read our passage for us today.
Thanks, Dave. Yes, this is from Romans 8, from verse 18. I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. For the creation waits in eager expectation for the children of God to be revealed. For the creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the freedom and glory of the children of God. We know that the whole creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time. Not only so, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for our adoption to sonship, the redemption of our bodies. For in this hope we were saved. But hope that is seen is no hope at all. Who hopes for what they already have? But if we hope for what we do not yet have, we wait for it patiently. In the same way, the Spirit helps us in our weakness. We do not know what we ought to pray for, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us through wordless groans. And he who searches our hearts knows the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for God's people in accordance with the will of God. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. For those God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. And those he predestined, he also called. Those he called, he also justified. Those he justified, he also glorified.
So this week, well, in fact, just yesterday, we were catching up with some really good friends of ours, and bless them, they had Apple TV. So while we were there, we used the opportunity to watch the latest season of Ted Lasso with them. If you don't know Ted Lasso, it's a whole thing right now. It's blowing up. It's really popular because it started off as a skit about an American football coach coming over to the UK to teach British people how to play soccer. And I think it was in the original skit, it was Tottenham Hotspurs that he was coaching. But in this, he coaches a fictional football team. It's now on to season 2. And in the episodes that we watched, the football team's not doing so great, and he's giving them the team a team talk to try and encourage them that it's going to be all right. And to do that, he talks about rom-communism. And it's his philosophy that no matter what happens in the present, no matter how difficult it's going to be right now, that in the end, it's all going to be all right. So as Ted Lasso puts it himself, look, the point is, fellas, if all those attractive people with their amazing apartments and interesting jobs, usually in some creative field, can go through some light-hearted struggles and still end up happy, so can we. Now, it may not work out how you think it will or how you hope it does, but believe me, it will all work out exactly as it's supposed to do. So it's a comedy. So that's a funny thing, but it's a genuine thing because for Ted, he's this incurable optimist. He genuinely thinks everything is going to be all right. And when you're watching a big budget Hollywood film, you know that everything is going to be all right. If Ewan McGregor and Scarlett Johansson are running through a burning building, as this film I was watching the other week, which was terrible, it was happening. Like, I knew they weren't going to die because, they were obviously paid a lot of money to be on, and you're not going to waste A-list talent. But, if there is a character there who you don't recognize that actor and have only just been introduced, they might die. But the main characters, everything's going to work out all right for them. Well, here's the amazing thing. And what we're looking at today is in Romans 8:28. We are given a promise that for those who love God, those who follow Jesus, we have that kind of A-list main character protection, that everything is actually, in the end, going to work all right. Or as Romans 8:28 puts it, we know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. That for those of us who love God, who follow Jesus, everything is going to work out all right. Now, this was obviously not written about filmmaking, but it was written to real people in real difficult situations, namely a bunch of Christians living in Rome when persecutions were starting to heighten. So to be a Christian at that time was most definitely not okay. So we heard in Geraldine's story that they came across some difficulties trying to foster because at the time they were Christians. And I know things have improved across the board generally in that respect, but in lots of other ways, following Jesus can often come with a price. And for people in Rome 2,000 years ago, that was an enormous price, which eventually would escalate to the point of a death sentence coming with following Jesus. It wasn't quite there yet, but these people were struggling against it every single day alongside the normal difficulties and struggles of life. And so they are written this long letter in which they are assured that in the end, everything is going to be all right, that they can actually stand in defiance of all the difficulties that are happening to them because God is at work in the middle of those difficulties. All things are being worked together for good. That means anything that happens in our life, even the most shameful things, even the most hurtful things, can be woven into a story for good. Even the times when we've messed up, even the times when we've done something wrong, God can reverse those situations and turn it to good. Now, this is better than any other alternative that we have for two good reasons. The first one is it is better than cynicism and it's better than sentimentality or naivety. So, a lot of people do confuse this belief in redemption for simple optimism. The simple belief, like Ted, that everything's going to work out all right just because I'm simply hoping against hope, or I just believe, or what. So it's not actually founded anything, but this is founded on something. This is founded on the basis of Jesus' resurrection, the fact that the worst thing that ever happened got reversed as a kind of proof that in the future all things are going to work out all right. And this promise was not written to people who had an abstract belief in this, but a group of people who'd actually already experienced the redeeming power of God in their own lives. So it is better than naive optimism, because naive optimism has nothing to base it on. It has no basis for the belief that things will get better. There's no reason to believe things will get better, but this has a basis. And it is also better than cynicism. Cynicism often looks like the sensible or the intelligent choice, that kind of raised eyebrow that doesn't really believe things really can get better, or even that things are only going to get worse, or that's just not the way the world works. And for people who look optimistic or believe in redemption, we can often look naive to the rest of the world. But cynicism never, ever improves the world. Cynicism never improves anyone else's life. Cynicism is actually a vote to give up on life. And so this actually gives us hope that things could be better. And it's based on the reality that God is guiding history, as evidenced most powerfully in the resurrection. The second reason it's better than any other alternative that we have is that it can actually deal with suffering. What I've noticed looking at most people's lives is when something difficult happens, whether that's simply painful or carries some element of shame to it, the temptation and the practice tends to be to bury it in some kind of way. So that might be to simply never talk about it and try not to think about it, or to medicate it away in some kind of way, whether that's through pizza or something much heavier. But what happens is it never actually does go away. There is no way of dealing with that suffering. And this is my one Tim Keller reference I'm allowed each talk. He's got a whole book on this called Walking with God Through Pain and Suffering. It's a really excellent book if you want to look at what the Christian worldview is on suffering, because what he does is compare the Christian worldview on suffering with every other major worldview on suffering, including Western secular view on suffering, which he, after an extensive study, comes to the conclusion is in the history of the world the worst at dealing with suffering because we simply have no place for it. So, a very short summary. We believe that through human progress, the world's going to get better and better and better. And as technology improves, as politics improves, as beliefs improve, etc., or whatever you're hanging your hat on, that things will get better. But the problem is when that doesn't happen, when you're faced with a problem you can't solve or something incredibly difficult has happened, there are simply no resources left to deal with it, which is why we have such massive industries in our culture based around pleasure. Because when you can't deal with something difficult, all you've got left is distraction through pleasure. Try and enjoy it. And so there's a great deal of people walking around who've had traumatic things happen in the past or their present, either done by themselves or by someone close to them, and they don't know what to do with it. And so they bury it, pretend it's never happened. And again, it's just one of those rules that I've slowly discovered is true, is that the people who are trying to present the shiniest fronts and the best image to the world, the people with the best looking Instagram feeds, are often covering up for the deepest darkness within. And actually, people who are whole and integrated and who can actually deal with the difficult things in their life won't be trying to paper over those cracks or cover up what's going on. So it will actually be the reverse of often what you see, that people who seem to be struggling and seem to be having difficulties are actually just people who aren't afraid to show that that's what life is like and that's what their life is like. And people who are projecting an image of everything's great are often covering up the deepest hurts and darknesses underneath. And in the economy of Jesus, we can actually bring to him all of the worst things that are happening, the hardest things about our lives right now, the most difficult things in our past. And he will actually redeem those things, turn them into our greatest strengths. Perhaps my favorite ever film about redemption was mentioned in our quiz before, is the Shawshank Redemption. And ultimately, this is a film all about how places of hopelessness can be turned into places of hope. So you've got this guy Andy who is imprisoned. We don't know if it was for something he did do or was falsely accused of. It kind of doesn't matter. What matters is you've got a place where people have lost all hope, but Andy Dufresne has not. There's this amazing scene where he hijacks the PA system and plays some Mozart over the speakers. And it's like a bit of heaven entering into this place of despair and hopelessness as hope floods in, something of heaven floods in. And he doesn't give up where everyone else gives up. There's a Viktor Frankl, the psychologist who we often refer to, who survived the concentration camps, put the idea of redemption like this: that everything can be taken from a man, but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. So that is, even when people take away every other freedom from you, i.e., putting you in prison, you still have the choice as to how you respond to that situation. And he did that for real in the concentration camps. Shawshank Redemption shows what it happens where, even in an incredibly oppressive and hopeless situation, the choice can be made to have a redemptive perspective instead. Now, for Lizzie and myself, this hasn't been some kind of abstract theory, but something that we've had to do. As many of you know, whilst I was training at Bible college and training up to be a vicar, we were surrounded by incredibly fertile vicars and their families who the number of children just seemed to keep growing and growing. Getting pregnant was incredibly easy for them. And that wasn't our story. Our story was one of multiple miscarriage and infertility and being unable to start a family and have children of our own. And so it was actually into that situation that we had to put this whole idea of God's redemption into practice. And there's just 3 lessons we learned through that time that I would like to share with you now of what it actually looks like when God gets redeeming your story, turning those difficult things into your strengths and into good things. The first is that expect things to get better, but in a different way to what you had in mind. So for us, the desire was we just want kids, and that's what we prayed for, and that's what we went to people to pray for us for, and that's what we read up about and did everything we could to try and make happen. And we went to all the right doctors and all that kind of thing. But in the end, that isn't what happened for us. But what did happen was that Lizzie wrote a memoir about our experience so that people who also went through this experience would know that they weren't alone and know what it felt like. It meant that our hearts were changed so that we became aware of the people who were being left out in church communities. We became aware of the fact that church can be a difficult place for those who don't have kids. It can be a difficult place for single people. And we can often put too much emphasis on the nuclear family unit at the loss of God's family unit. We started helping out at Rhythm of Hope, this thing that meets up every year to help Christian couples who are struggling with infertility issues and childlessness in all different kinds of ways, to give them hope and to help them through their situations. We changed in who we were. We changed who we were helping. We created spaces for people who were grieving, because we realized as well that churches weren't being amazing at opening up space for people who were hurting and to give them space and how to heal themselves. We actually learned how to grieve. It wasn't really a skill that we had, and so we learned it. And we grew as people around all of this grief, and we grew, and our characters grew, and God did all kinds of redeeming work. So in order that the world around us became better, a bit like Andy Dufresne in the Shawshank Redemption, that there was not just our own healing, but the healing of people we encountered. But that good was not what we were praying for at the start. It's not what we could have even imagined at the start of that whole process, but it was something much bigger, a much different vision of the good. And so in Romans 8:28, when we are promised that we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, that good isn't defined on our terms, because it's defined according to his purpose. It's what God is doing in the world. And so often God will do a greater and more nuanced and complex and better good than any good that we can imagine. So it will get better. And we've been through that process of redemption in our own lives, but that end was different to the good that we wanted. So, for example, this verse is one of those ones that is classically misused. Someone's going through a difficult situation, so you put this verse on the fridge, God works for the good, and what they're thinking is, I will get everything that I want, and soon. And that's not what it's promising. It's not promising, for example, material wealth or an answer to your specific problem, but rather God is knitting all of human history and all lives around you into a greater vision than one that you have, into a greater good than the one that you are hoping for. So it will be better, but not necessarily in the way that you expect. A second kind of practical lesson about redemption that we learned as we went through it is that in order to move forward, you have to apply a redemptive perspective to your past. So every single human being who's ever lived, every one of us has had difficult things happen in our past, and we don't always deal with them. So a couple of years ago, I had a lump started to come up on my neck, and every now and again, Lizzie goes, "That lump getting bigger?" I'm like, "Oh no, it's fine. Don't notice. It's not a problem." Is that lump getting? And for months and months and months, I ignored this lump on my neck, and it could have been absolutely anything. But eventually, it got enormous, and it got red, and it got angry looking, and then I had to go to the doctors, and in the end, it was some cream that cured it and took it away. But I was afraid to even look at the lump. And that is often what happens to the things that have happened in our past, is that something gets in, and it can sometimes even be a small thing, a small incident, but sometimes it can be a big incident that we don't deal with and we don't look at and we want to ignore. hoping that it's going to go away. But what happens is that it gets infected and it grows and it gets bigger and it gets angry and it starts to affect our present. And so, what we have to do is to look back on those difficult things, face them, find out where God was at work in them, and look at what good things God has brought out of them or could bring out of them if we allow Him to. And here's the amazing thing is when you look at those difficult things in your past that you've been ignoring this whole time, sometimes you will realize that God was actually there in those difficult moments, that in the brokenness, there was some beauty. In the pain, there was the presence of Christ right in the middle of it. And that He was at work right there. And then actually all kinds of good things have come out of it. Maybe you have changed as a person, or you have done some good as a result of that hard thing. And when we actually apply that redemptive perspective to our past, it changes our future for the better and those of those around us. Quite often in church, it is tempting to leave this lesson simply at forgiveness. You know, something bad's happened, you just have to forgive and then move on. But forgiveness was never meant to be the end of the story, but the start of it. Forgiveness is a doorway to step through to a better story that involves ongoing healing, ongoing redemption, something great coming out of the difficult thing, not in spite of it, but actually using the evil thing that happened that God did not cause, but what God does cause is the redemption that happens after it. And this is the approach that we had to take when we lived through all of our own losses, was for Jesus to take the wheel and turn those wounds into scars. And, you know, one thing we've noticed is that some people live out of scars and others live out of wounds. Scar tissue is actually stronger than our normal tissue. If you have a scar, that part of your body is actually stronger than before it was wounded. But a wound is open to infection. It's not strong, it is weak. And quite often you will find people who've not dealt with the difficult things in the past, often leaking out of their wound onto other people, causing more and more damage. But the reverse is true. If we go through that redemptive process with God, is that it becomes scar tissue, it becomes something stronger and actually ends up healing other people. It reverses that pain into something healing. The third and final thing, and maybe the most important thing about this whole redemptive process that we go through with Jesus, is that Jesus is the end and not the means. So in our own story, we started drawing closer to God because He could give us something we wanted, which at the time was children. And so that's when we started to pray more. That's when we started to read more. We started to draw closer to God in all kinds of ways. But in the day of Jesus, there would often be people who came to Him for healing and then just disappeared off, never to be heard from again. And it remains as true today, that people will often draw closer to God when they want something from Him. But what God wants more than anything is us. He wants a relationship with us. He wants to be close to us and to know us. And this whole redemptive healing process is actually the byproduct of becoming close to God. We should want Jesus for Himself and not for the things He can do for us, because it's actually by drawing close to Him, by becoming like Him, that we are healed. The verse after Romans 8:28 is 8:29, which says, "For those God foreknew, He also predestined to be conformed to the likeness of His Son." Or as we put it, be with Jesus, to become like Jesus, and to do the kinds of things that Jesus did. God's plan for us is that we would become like Jesus, like His only begotten Son, that we would be transformed in our own likeness to be like Him. And when we do that, we bring that redemptive healing to those who are around us, just as happened in Geraldine's story. We're going to be praying for you, and we're going to be praying for Afghanistan in just a moment. But here's the contradiction of what we're going to be praying for. We're going to be praying for amongst other things, the church in Afghanistan, where they were already facing an enormous amount of persecution. One list puts them at the second worst country on earth in which to be a Christian, because it's so persecuted there. But they also are very close to the top of the list of the fastest growing church in the world. And this happens time and time again, where Christians face the greatest opposition. They also experience the most growth. It happens throughout history. It's happening today. Those countries where Christians are outlawed and persecuted and put down are also where they become most like Jesus, where most people start following Jesus. And some of us are running from the very pain which Jesus wants to meet us in, to redeem, so that we become more like him. So I'd encourage you to take that invitation to become more like Jesus, to be redeemed through the difficult turns of life.